Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. Today I am making two cards, and they are both reindeer cards. The first one, one of them will feature this Spellbinders reindeer die, and the other card will feature this Simon Says stamp reindeer stamp. I'm also using these Spellbinder circle dies, and I have two pieces of pattern paper. I think they're actually from Honeybee Stamps. They were in my Christmas paper collection. I will be coloring on Strathmore Bristol paper because I'm using my Zig Cling Color watercolor pens. And true story, I forgot how these work. There is a little bit of trial and error in here. I will be stamping in VersaClear Nocturne Black ink, and then I will heat emboss that with clear embossing powder, just to kind of keep that ink well defined, and it gives me some kind of borders. I forgot two things. I forgot that the Zig pens work best with a color blender or with blending each other together, and I forgot that I bought the Zig blender pen. So first I tried a water brush, then I tried an old Stampin' Up! Blender pen, and then I remembered that I had the Zig color blender pen, and from there it went fine. I did purchase at one point in time some Arteza water brush pens. They do not work the same, and so I think I might want to increase my collection of Zig pens. I don't have very many colors, and so like the shading for the red, I have one red pen, and it's not even a true red, so I had to add some black and gray to it to get some shading and definition. So I think I might add that to my Christmas list and see what my husband and Santa Claus decide they want to add to my craft room this year. But anyway, now that we've talked about the coloring, let's go ahead and jump into the crime. I will tell you that this is a longer story, and I am hoping that I have enough video footage to make one video out of it. If not, I'll see where we can break it up. Anyway, let's jump into it. Our journey today takes us to Pennsylvania. Now, just a little recap of the statehood of Pennsylvania. The area of Pennsylvania was part of the original territory of the United States. It was chartered in 1681, although it was originally part of New York, and New York did not relinquish its claim until like 1682. Pennsylvania ratified the U.S. Constitution on December 12, 1787, and it was the second of the original 13 colonies to join the Union, or the 13 states to join the Union. Pennsylvania is assumed generally the same boundary as its current state, with the acquisition of the Erie Triangle from New York in 1792. So, fun facts about Pennsylvania. America's first baseball stadium was built in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1909. The city of Philadelphia was home to the First Continental Congress of the United States and was the location of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania is home to the groundhog Punxsutawney Phil, who famously or infamously predicts the weather every Groundhog Day. Pennsylvania is home to a number of snack companies, including Hershey's, Utz, Planters, and Auntie Anne's. Of all the 13 colonies, Pennsylvania is the only one that does not border the Atlantic Ocean, and Pennsylvania is home to one of the earliest kidnappings for ransom. And I know we've had a few of those this year, but this one is interesting. So we're going to start by meeting Christian Ross. He was born on the 6th of November, 1822 in Middletown, Pennsylvania, and his parents were Joseph and Catherine Ross. And it seems like, according to all the records I found, that the family lived in the same general area for many, many years. Sarah Ann Lewis was born on the 10th of September, 1834 in Brooklyn, New York, and her parents are Henry and Sophia Lewis. Now, Christian and Sarah Ann met and were married on the 24th of July, 1862 in Middletown, Pennsylvania. They were the parents of 6 sons and 3 daughters. And Charles made a good life for his family as the owner and operator of Ross Schott, S-C-H-O-T-T, and Company. They were a dry goods wholesaler. Their family home was in Philadelphia's Germantown neighborhood. It was a nice middle-to-upper-class neighborhood. And they seemed to be doing okay. But during the summer of 1874, Sarah Ann began to have some health crises. Christian actually moved his ailing wife to Atlantic City with the hope that the sea air would improve her health. Their 6-year-old daughter, Sophia, went with her mother to Atlantic City, Their oldest children, 10-year-old Augustus and 8-year-old Henry, were sent to spend the summer with their grandparents in Middleton. And the 2 youngest children, Marianne and 1-year-old Anne Christine, were just babies. And so I guess they had a nanny or a nurse or something. And that just left the couple's middle children were 2 boys, a 5-year-old boy named Walter and a 4-year-old boy named Charles, who was called Charlie, under the care of their father. So, Sarah Ann is trying to get healthy, and Charles has collected all the family help he can to take care of his children for the summer. Now, Walter and Charlie were considered well-behaved boys, but they were still young boys, and they did have a habit of finding mischief. At dinner one evening, the boys told their father a tale about their day and about a carriage of men that had been riding through the neighborhood and giving out red and white ribbon candy. Christian chastised them for talking to strangers and advised them not to do it again. And by advice, he probably said, "Stop talking to strangers, you crazy people. Have you not heard of the kidnappings?" Because this was becoming a more common crime, or a more notable crime at any rate. So Christian came home from work on Wednesday, July 1st, 1874. And as he got closer to home, he realized how quiet his neighborhood was. Like, too quiet. And if you have children, you know that too quiet usually means mischief. When he got home, he didn't see his boys, and he assumed then that they were playing at a neighbor's home. That was kind of their norm. So Christian, he had pulled a wagon of sand home for his boys to use to let off fireworks on the 4th. And he was surprised to not see or hear them around the home. He was expecting them to be, all excited to see him because he was bringing, because he was coming home from work and he had this fun pile of sand. And it was just too unsettling. He was worried a little bit. However, this was the range of what we now call free range, or the time of what we call free range parenting, right? And so instead of focusing on his growing apprehension, Christian sat down on the porch with a newspaper, and he asked the housekeeper to bring his evening tea. And when he finished the paper, he looked up and saw the sun was setting, and the boys still had not returned home. And that's kind of like, if you're a child of my generation or earlier, the setting sun or the streetlights coming on was kind of your, hey, it's time to go home, right? That was your clue. So Christian put the newspaper down, and he walked up the street to the neighbor's house to collect his sons. And when he got to the home of the neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Kidder, she told Christian that the boys had taken a ride in a carriage with somebody she did not know. And as she described the carriage and the men, it matched the description the sons had given him about the men who'd given them the candy. So clearly these mischievous boys had not followed their father's instructions regarding talking to strangers. Now, Christian is standing there talking to his neighbor, and he's becoming more and more alarmed, and his parent instincts and his guts are on fire now. And then all of a sudden, he sees Walter, the older of the 2 brothers, being led down the street by a complete stranger. And when the man walked up to Christian, he introduced himself as Henry Peacock, and he was a railroad worker. He told Christian that he'd found Walter crying and in severe distress on the street corner, clear across the city in Kensington near the street ferry. Henry had then taken the rest of the afternoon off and brought Walter home. So good job, Henry. Walter, he had quite the story to tell. Walter told his father that earlier that day he and Charlie were playing in the street when the strange men had come back around with their wagon. And according to Walter, they'd been through the neighborhood multiple times in the previous week. And so Walter and Charlie were it had become routine to see these men whose names they didn't know with a wagon they hadn't seen before. And usually when the men went through the neighborhood, they were handing out handfuls of candy and started asking questions. Questions like, is that big house yours? Is your mommy pretty? Is your daddy rich? Is anybody at home right now? But today they had a new question for the children, especially Walter and Charlie. Do you boys want to go get some firecrackers? Well, of course they did. Of course they did. What young boys wouldn't? So the enticement of the firecrackers convinced Walter and Charlie to hop into the wagon and head off to the store to get firecrackers. Now, Walter told his father that he first assumed that they were just going to town to the general store on Main Street. But the men said no, they knew a place where they could get more for their money, like they could get less expensive fireworks. Wherever that was, it wasn't close. Walter said the wagon took a very convoluted route. I can't remember the word that he used, but convoluted route that went all over the city, and the trip took them a long time, and the longer it took, the more Charlie got upset. Now, in order to keep Charlie calm, the men stopped at a corner store, and Walter described one man as the man with a monkey nose. This man gave Walter a shiny new quarter and told him to run in and get some fireworks for Charlie. So Walter went into the store with the quarter, and he came back outside, and the wagon was gone. His brother was gone. The men were gone. And this is where Henry Peacock found Walter crying on the boardwalk. Walter then told his father he wasn't sad. He was angry that he'd been left behind. He didn't realize that Charlie was in danger. He just felt like he was being left out of a fun adventure. Christian, though, now he's hitting full-on panic at this point, right? For 3 days, 3 sleepless days and nights, Christian retraced the route that Walter described, walking through the streets of Germantown and into Kensington looking for Charlie. Sometimes he was helped by the police, sometimes he was helped by his in-laws, and sometimes he was even helped by Henry Peacock. And he was able to get a more detailed description of the abductors from neighbors and visitors, but they really couldn't find a trace of the wagon or the men driving it after it left the Kensington area. The police were surprisingly unhelpful. They dismissed Christian's concerns, suggesting that the 2 boys had been picked up by some drunks and that Charlie would be returned after they sobered up. That was their explanation for this kidnapping. They were happy to help the search in their own unique way, though. They went around harassing homeless people. It had nothing to do with the case, mind you, but it was something that the police in the area had kind of a reputation of doing, and this gave them here's my air quotes, you can't see, legitimate reason to do so. With no solid leads to follow up on, Christian then did the only thing he could do. He put an ad in 2 of Philadelphia's largest newspapers, offering a reward for the safe return of his child. And this is what his ad read, quote, $300 reward. $300 will be paid for the return to number 304 Market Street, Philadelphia, of a small boy aged 4 years named Charlie Brewster Ross. He is dressed in a brown linen suit with a short skirt and broad-rimmed, unbleached Panama hat with a black ribbon and laced shoes and blue and white striped stockings. He has long, flaxen, curly hair, hazel eyes, clear skin, a round, full face, and is well-formed without any marks except those made by the vaccination on the arm. Charlie and his brother got into a wagon with 2 men on Washington Lane near Chew Street, Germantown, to take a ride between 4 and 5 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, July 1st. The eldest boy was found at Palmer and Richmond Streets, but Charlie, the younger, is still missing. The reward above will be paid for his return to my store as above, or any information which shall lead to his recovery. Christian K. Ross, number 304 Market Street. On the 4th, Saturday the 4th, Christian received a letter in the mail confirming his worst fears. The spelling and the grammar were atrocious, but the message was crystal clear. Somebody had in fact taken Charlie, and they wanted money for his return. And any attempt to involve the police would result in the death of Charlie, and the kidnappers promised to follow up soon. 2 days later, on July 6th, Christian got the promised follow-up when the kidnappers, through personal ads in the papers, told him that Charlie was in their care and fine for now. They were sure he'd be willing to pay $1 million for his return, but they were only asking $20,000. There was just one problem with the kidnappers' demands. Charlie Ross didn't have $20,000. $20,000 in 1874 would be equivalent to about $536,000 today. At this time, the salary of the President of the U.S., President Grant, was only $25,000. And to make matters worse, Christian's fortune was lost in the stock market. He was, the Panic of 1873 had done a real number on the firm of Ross, Schott and Company, and he was in fact living on credit extended from his creditors because he had a reputation of being an honest man and a hard worker, and it was expected that he would repay that debt. A third letter then arrived on July 7th with more instructions and threats, again with more troubled spelling and horrible grammar as well. The kidnappers wanted to be sure that Christian was willing to pay the ransom. They made ridiculous innuendos that he loved money more than his child, and that if it wasn't, and if that wasn't true, if he loved his child more than his fortune, he would follow their directions. He was instructed to respond through the personals if he wanted his son back. Christian tried to appease the kidnappers without telling them he was broke, only to receive indignant response on July 9th. The kidnappers angrily suggested they would kill Charlie if they didn't get the money without delay. They indicated they would be willing to negotiate. While Christian conducted negotiations with the kidnappers through the personals, he was trying all he could to find his son. The police were still operating ineffectively, rounding up homeless people and searching abandoned buildings, hassling anyone traveling with children, and, as usual in this case, not helpful at all. At this point, the newspapers got involved. They learned that Charlie was missing when Christian walked into their offices to take out his first reward notice. But now the massive police response and cryptic personal ads had tipped off the fact that he had been kidnapped. And by massive police response, I mean the hustling of homeless people. So European-style kidnapping for ransom was uncommon in the United States at this time. This was the first actual documented kidnap for ransom in the country's history, and the public was fascinated by it. The newspapers fed interest by writing article after article about the case, often repeating the same things because there was very little information. Their coverage was indiscriminate, and it was often dishonest. Several early stories mentioned that the police were watching the Central Post Office to try and catch the criminals when they mailed their ransom notes. But that only caused the ransom notes to become far and few between, and they were no longer being posted from the central office, but from tiny mail post offices throughout the state and even other states. So the Philadelphia police politely asked the newspapers to back off before they lost all of their leads, as if they had any. And some of the papers, like the Ledger, did. Others, like the Enquirer, did not. Police responded by shutting down all official lines of communication with the press, and the press responded by running their own parallel investigations. The overlapping flood of official and unofficial information just wound up causing confusion to the general public, the kidnappers, and even the Ross family. The kidnappers had finally caught on to the fact that maybe 4- and 5-year-olds didn't necessarily have a detailed knowledge of their household finances. You know that question, are your parents rich? Is that big house yours? And by now they realized the Rosses were almost bankrupt. But instead of lowering their ransom demands, they just told the Rosses to beg, borrow, and steal money from friends and family. All the while, Christian had been trying to keep the worst of the bad news from his sick wife because he was afraid she would have a nervous breakdown. I couldn't find anything about her specific illness that sent her to Atlantic City, but if he was worried about a breakdown, she must have been very unhealthy. Maybe it was mental health. Maybe she was just worried that she wouldn't recover from this devastating news. But in trying to protect his wife, he ended up having a nervous breakdown himself. And in order to save his sanity, Christian turned over the handling of the negotiations to an advisory committee. Okay. This committee composed of the mayor, the managing editor of the Public Ledger, and a member of the board of public charities, and a prominent lawyer. This actually turned out to be the worst decision Christian could have made. The advisory committee was more interested in creating the appearance that they were looking for Charlie and protecting the public and maintaining law and order than actually looking for Charlie. The city was deep in preparations for the World's Fair that was scheduled to be held there in 1876, and who would come to the city if kidnappers were on the loose. So this was all about optics and not at all about finding Charly. The advisory's committee long-term plan was to string the kidnappers along either until they had slipped up and were caught, or until the police, here's my air quotes again, investigation, made them cut bait and run. They ignored one thing the kidnappers had tried to drill into Christian's head from the start. Without the ransom being paid, Charly was dead. The idea that the kidnappers were serious never occurred to the committee members. At least part of their plan was working. The police were starting to make things very uncomfortable for the kidnappers. They had apparently had to relocate further out from the city, slowing the frequency of their correspondence to one letter every few days. The ransom notes were getting longer and longer. The threats were getting more specific and pointed. The grammar and spelling improved, which suggested that maybe now the notes were being written by somebody else, or that semi-literate style of the early notes was a front, a fake. The kidnappers were completely confused at the conflicting messages they were getting from Ross, the advisory committee, and the press. In another message, they wrote that they didn't understand what was going on. The newspaper reports made them question whether the money was coming from or where it was coming from, and again said it would be a really bad idea not to pay the ransom. On July 18th, the police suddenly announced they had captured one of the kidnappers. A man named Chris Wooster. He was a confidence man and a thief who had been in and out of jail so often he was on a first-name basis with every police officer in the Philadelphia police force. They had no specific evidence against Wooster, mind you, not at all, but had a plan to beat the tar out of him until they told him what he wanted to hear, and it worked, and it didn't. Wooster confessed they had been planning to kidnap a child, but it had abandoned the idea because it was too dangerous. And in addition to that, he had an ironclad alibi. He had been laid up for 2 weeks due to injuries he sustained in a bar fight. The police reluctantly released Wooster and then gave a dynamite interview to the papers where he offered his professional opinion that both sides were dragging this thing out far too long. So Wooster is like giving it to the police and the papers, right? And the kidnappers, it sounds like. He suggested that they should set up an exchange at Niagara Falls so the Rosses could have their boy back and the criminals could be safe from extradition on the Canadian side of the border. Charly had now been missing for 3 weeks, and things were starting to get crazy, or crazier, because it sounds like they already are crazy. People were seeing Charly Ross everywhere. At one point, police claimed to have found the boy, only to have to awkwardly backtrack when it turned out this was a different Charly Ross, who was at least 4 years too old. Homeless children from Gloucester, Camden, and Vinland, New Jersey were brought in as the missing boy, even though they didn't match the description of Charly at all. Other Charlies popped up, even showing up as far away as Washington, D.C. and Denver, Colorado. There was even a Charly Ross whose only physical similarity to the missing Charly Ross was that he was wearing a Panama hat and a brown linen suit. Like, not the same hair color, age, size, anything. Christian and his family tried to personally verify each and every one. The process was expedited by a simple trick. They withheld Charly's actual eye color from the press, which made it easy to cut through a sea of blonde-haired, blue-eyed pretenders. At one point, the number of fake Charly Rosses got so bad that Christian Ross actually started carrying around a stack of pre-printed certificates that mothers could show the police to prove that their child had already been investigated, and no, he wasn't that Charly Ross. Chaos! Oh my heavens, chaos. Still, the Philadelphia police had no leads, and so they ratcheted things up to the next level, conducting an unprecedented and entirely unconstitutional door-to-door search of the entire city. There were so many cops combing the streets, the crime rate actually dropped to 0 for a few weeks. It was great for law and order, but in the end, it was all for nothing. There was still no sign of Charly anywhere. The papers were still speculating wildly, claiming that Charly had been kidnapped by all manner of crazy individuals with nefarious intentions, including fictional gangs and fictional people. The Reading Daily Eagle was probably the worst paper of the group. It published a lengthy article claiming that Christian's respectability was just a front, that he was secretly a degenerate drunk and a filthy gambler, and the kidnapping was part of a revenge plot orchestrated by his vindictive ex-wife. Not a word of it was true. The Daily Eagle was forced to fork over a hefty settlement to Christian after the subsequent libel trial. For their part, the kidnappers kept up with a steady stream of correspondence. As the weeks wore on, they became increasingly obsessed with finding a way of conducting the exchange without getting followed by the police. And then on July 30th, they unveiled their master plan. Christian was to take the 12 p.m. train to New York and then a cab to Grand Central Station, then take the 8 a.m. express and stand on the rear car platform. They said they would make contact before he got to Albany. They also said that if for some reason they couldn't make contact, Christian was to look for a letter at the post office addressed to CK with further directions. They promised that if he followed those directions, Charly would be returned safely, but if he failed, Charly would die. Christian followed those convoluted instructions to the T. The kidnappers did not. It turns out they had called off their man when they saw an article in the Ledger claiming Christian had gone to Pottsville to check out another fraudulent Charly Ross. And except that the newspapers were a day behind. So the newspapers were reporting something that happened on Wednesday when Christian's supposed to be headed to Albany on Thursday. And the kidnappers were reading it on Friday. It was a mess. And adding to that, it wasn't Christian Ross who had gone to check out this most recent Charly Ross. It was a man named Frank Lewis. It was probably for the best. Christian's valise was not packed full of $20,000 in small unmarked bills. In fact, the only thing inside was a letter from the advisory committee telling the kidnappers that their plan was garbage and insisting on a simultaneous exchange. If that note had made its way to the kidnappers, they probably would have killed Charly, out of pure spite. The kidnappers remained adamantly opposed to the idea of a simultaneous exchange. They proposed a simpler plan, sending a message to Christian's store to pick up the cash, or sending a messenger, rather, to Christian's store to pick up the cash, but the advisory committee shot that down too. The advisory committee was really starting to get full of its own importance. They had given themselves way more authority than they originally were invested with. And they insisted that the kidnappers switch up the aliases used to communicate in the personals, which were starting to attract copycats. They then insisted that the kidnappers stop using the personals altogether and appointed an attorney or some other intermediary to negotiate on their behalf. Then they began demanding proof of any kind that Charly was even still alive and in their custody. And the kidnappers responded. In mid-August, the kidnappers stopped writing back. Newspapers continued to try and one-up each other, but there was no new news to report. By now, Christian Ross had run out of patience with the advisory committee. He said, quote, "The public were clamorous for the arrest and punishment of the kidnappers at any cost, yet were ignorant of the risk to the life of my child and the consequent terror to which I was subjected. It is comparatively easy to sacrifice another man's child for the public good, and my anxious suspense is easier to conceive than borne." End quote. Christian began to take matters into his own hands again. He determined that the advisory committee was up to no good. With donations from concerned citizens and well-wishers, he actually had enough money to hire the Pinkertons to take on the case. The Pinkertons, though, turned out to be even more useless than the Philadelphia police. Their plan was to charge Christian a hefty fee, and their entire investigation was to hang up posters and stand on street corners and pass out flyers. The kidnappers resurfaced again once in late August. They refused to provide physical proof which could easily be traced back to them. Instead, they gave a detailed description of their escape route, which matched the one that Walter remembered, along with a host of tiny details that would have been unknown to outsiders, like a detailed description of Charly's outfit and the fact that he lost his hat in Trenton. The advisory committee seized on a few minor discrepancies in their story as an excuse to stonewall and demand more proof. They still didn't seem to think their delaying tactics would win out in the end. Guess what? They didn't get an answer. And by early September, the kidnappers went silent again. About the same time, Chris Wooster re-entered the story when the police found him poking around with a shovel in the basement of a house on Knox Street in Philadelphia. He said he'd been searching for Charlie Ross and had permission from the district attorney to do so. He didn't, and he wasn't. In fact, he was trying to break through the cellar door to rob the house next door. He was promptly arrested, and the police astonishingly discovered the body of a child in the basement. However, it turned out to be a stillborn baby that had been buried the previous year by a grieving mother. Wooster also re-entered the story in another unexpected way. When the kidnappers finally resumed correspondence on September 25th, they mentioned they'd gone to Canada to investigate the cross-border exchange Wooster had proposed back in July. It turns out it wasn't a great plan. It was true that Canada would not extradite you for kidnapping. The subsequent extortion, though, well, that was a completely different matter, and Canada was happy to would happily extradite them back to the U.S. for extortion. The kidnappers started to seem rather eager to be done with the whole situation, and to that end, they proposed a vastly simplified exchange. No messing around with elaborate spy stuff. Instead, they suggested that Christian should just take the $20,000 ransom to a hotel in New York, any hotel in New York, and then take out a personal ad letting the kidnappers know which one. One of their agents would simply come by and pick up the money, and 10 hours later, Charlie would be returned. Simple and hard to mess up. The Rosses wearily agreed to the exchange, overriding the objections of the police and the advisory committee. It took over a month of slow, tedious haggling to gather the money and work out the fine details. What date they would make the exchange, what pseudonym they would use in the personals, if it would be acceptable to send Frank Lewis, if Christian Ross was ill, but, all these details they needed to work out. But finally the day arrived, and the name used was Saul of Tarsus. The place was the Fifth Avenue Hotel, and the day was October 18th. Frank Lewis waited in the Fifth Avenue Hotel all day on the 18th, and no one showed. Hardly surprising, really, since the lobby of the hotel was packed with undercover New York police officers, and the street had extra patrols roaming. The Rosses took out one more personal ad. Saul of Tarsus, we have performed our part to the letter. You have again broken faith. We will have no more trifling. Action must be now simultaneous. But that was it. No one ever heard from the kidnappers again. Okay, that seems like a good place for a break. I still have over 2 pages of notes on this case, so I think that we will come back to it next week and finish it up. I did try to make these eyes on the reindeer look a little bit less wonky, and even after I took the pictures for the thumbnail, I even fixed them up later after that. It was just a process of nonsense and shenanigans. But here are a couple of pictures of the cards close up, and I will add a couple of pictures of Charlie and his family in the conclusion of our story. So thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoyed this story. I have a couple of other videos down here that I think you would like. I've also added that subscribe button. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, I would love it if you did. Leave me a thumbs up if you like the video. Leave me a comment down below, and have a really fabulous day.